Three of the greatest military commanders in European history decided to invade Russia. One of them had compiled an almost unbroken string of battlefield victories and was considered militarily invincible by every European power of his era. One of them commanded the largest land army ever assembled to that point. One of them had spent years dismantling every neighboring military force that stood in his way. All three lost everything. Not in weeks, not in a dramatic final stand, not because of a brilliant enemy counter-offensive. They lost the same way, following the same sequence of events, triggered by the same decision Russia made before a single major battle was even fought. And here is what makes this genuinely strange. The first time this happened was in 1709. The last time was 1941. That's 232 years, three different Russian governments, three completely different military doctrines, different commanders, different weapons, different armies, different enemies. The same result. What you're about to see is not a coincidence. It is a documented, repeated strategic reality, one that military academies study, that historians have written about in detail, and that three of the most powerful commanders in European history failed to account for, each in their own generation. The trick isn't complicated, but it is almost impossible to defeat once it starts working on you. Here's what it is. To understand why this matters, you need to understand who Charles XIV was in 1707, because if you don't know that, the 1812 story and the 1941 story make less sense. By 1707, the Kingdom of Sweden was not a regional power. It was the dominant military force in Northern Europe. The Swedish Empire at its height controlled Finland, Estonia, Latvia, large portions of what is today Germany and Poland, and held strategic command of the Baltic Sea. The Swedish military, trained under a system of mandatory service and aggressive tactical doctrine, had spent the previous century winning. Charles XIV specifically had won. At the Battle of Narva in 1700, his army of roughly 8,000 to 10,000 men attacked a Russian force of approximately 35,000 to 40,000 and won decisively. He followed that with victories in Poland, Saxony, and along the entire eastern Baltic. By 1707, no European military analyst would have bet against him. He was considered, by the standards of his time, militarily invincible. In 1707, he made the decision to march on Russia, specifically to push east and force Tsar Peter I, who was in the middle of a military modernization project that Charles XIV knew would eventually threaten Swedish dominance, into a decisive engagement. End the Great Northern War with a knockout blow, one campaign, one result. The Russian response was not to meet him in the field. What Peter I did instead, and what historians document clearly, was retreat, systematically, deliberately, while destroying everything behind them as they went. Villages, crops, granaries, wells, burned or contaminated, infrastructure that an invading army could use to sustain itself across vast distances was methodically removed from the equation. This was not panic. This was documented Russian military doctrine being executed against an enemy whose entire strategy depended on speed, aggressive advance, and living off captured territory. Charles VIII's army advanced through what had been food-producing land and found nothing. His supply lines, already stretched across difficult terrain with primitive road infrastructure, began to fail. And then came the winter of 1708 to 1709, which is documented in historical records as the coldest European winter in at least 500 years. Temperatures dropped so severely that the Baltic Sea froze over completely for months, allowing travel on foot between countries. Rivers across the continent locked solid, and contemporary accounts described birds falling dead from the trees in the extreme cold. The Swedish army, designed for fast aggressive warfare, not endurance in extreme cold, began to deteriorate before any significant battle had been fought. By July 1709, when the two armies finally met at Poltava, Charles V was commanding a force reduced by attrition, starvation, frostbite, and disease to somewhere between 17,000 and 25,000 men, many of them already exhausted and undersupplied. Against a reformed Russian army that Peter I had spent years rebuilding, now numbering approximately 75,000 to 80,000 troops. The Battle of Poltava on July 8, 1709, lasted a few hours. Swedish losses totaled around 9,000 killed and wounded in the battle itself. In the days following, approximately 12,000 to 16,000 remaining Swedish soldiers were captured at the Dnieper River crossing. Charles V escaped with roughly 1,500 men. He fled to the Ottoman Empire and spent years there trying to engineer a return that never came. The Swedish Empire, as a dominant European power, ended at Poltava. Formally, the Great Northern War concluded with the Treaty of Nystad in 1721. But the strategic outcome was decided in 1709 by the conditions created before a major battle was even fought. One detail that gets underreported in most tellings of this story: Peter I did not invent this approach from nothing. The scorched earth response to invasion had precedence in Russian military thinking going back centuries. But Poltava is the first clearly documented case where it was applied systematically, at scale, against a major European power, and produced this specific sequence of attrition, environmental collapse, and decisive defeat. If that's new information to you, and it is for most people, drop a comment below. It means the channel is doing what it's supposed to do. The pattern had been established. 103 years later, a different kind of army stood at the Russian border. The Grande Armée that crossed the Neman River on June 24, 1812, was multinational, logistically sophisticated by the standards of its era, and enormous. Estimates from historical records place the initial invasion force at somewhere between 450,000 and 600,000 troops, making it the largest single army ever assembled in European history to that point. At its head was a commander who had reshaped the map of Europe, defeated Prussia, Austria, and numerous other powers, and who had turned tactical flexibility and rapid, decisive engagement into a military doctrine that every European general was trying to understand and replicate. He expected Russia to fight in the field. The Russian response to the Grande Armée's crossing was not a battle. The Russian commanders, General Barclay de Tolly initially, later Field Marshal Kutuzov, retreated. Continuously. The same documented logic: deny the invader resources, stretch the supply lines, use the land itself as a weapon. Villages were burned before the French columns arrived. Crops were destroyed. The road and river infrastructure that would have allowed Napoleon's enormous logistics train to keep pace with his fighting force was systematically degraded. The Russian army fought rearguard actions, sharp, short engagements designed to slow and bleed the advancing force, without committing to the decisive pitched battle that Napoleon needed. What Napoleon needed was a Jena, an Austerlitz, a Wagram, a concentrated engagement where his superior tactical ability and his army's battlefield excellence could end the campaign in days or weeks. Russia refused to give it to him. The French army advanced 600 miles into Russian territory over the summer of 1812. Every mile added to supply lines that were already struggling. Every burned village meant no food. Every destroyed bridge meant delay. The army that entered Russia in late June began shedding men to disease, starvation, desertion, and the physical demands of marching across undeveloped terrain at speed. Estimates suggest Napoleon had already lost between 150,000 and 200,000 men without a major battle by the time the Russian army finally stood and fought at Borodino on September 7, 1812. Borodino is worth understanding in its own right. It was the bloodiest single day of the Napoleonic Wars, approximately 70,000 to 80,000 casualties between both sides in a single day of fighting. The French held the field at the end. Napoleon technically won the engagement. But Kutuzov withdrew the Russian army intact, damaged, bloodied but not destroyed, and continued the retreat toward Moscow. Napoleon needed the Russian army shattered and the Russian political will broken. He got neither. He entered Moscow on September 14, 1812, and found it burning. The Russians had not simply evacuated the city, they had set it on fire. Approximately 3/4 of the buildings in Moscow were destroyed over the days following the French arrival. Napoleon waited in the ruins for weeks, hoping that Tsar Alexander I would negotiate, would offer terms, would acknowledge the French army sitting in his burned capital as sufficient grounds for peace. Alexander never sent a letter. The logic of waiting in Moscow until winter arrived was catastrophic. By the time Napoleon ordered the retreat in October, temperatures were already dropping. His army was consuming the last of its dwindling supplies in an evacuated and burned city, and the Russian forces outside Moscow were beginning to press in. The retreat that began on October 19, 1812, became one of the most documented military catastrophes in European history. By December, when the remnants of the Grande Armée crossed back across the Niemen into East Prussia, somewhere between 20,000 and 22,000 men remained in any coherent military organization, from an invasion force that had numbered close to 500,000. The army that had remade Europe did not lose to a Russian army in a climactic battle. It lost to space, to burned crops, to roads that didn't exist. To a winter, it arrived at already too weak to survive. Now here is the question, and this is where it gets serious. Did no one in 1941 know what had happened in 1812? Every general staff in Europe knew the 1812 campaign in detail. It was studied at military academies. Karl von Clausewitz, whose writing on the nature of war became the theoretical foundation for modern Western military doctrine, had personally served in the 1812 campaign as a Russian commissioned officer and wrote extensively about what happened and why. The German officers who planned Operation Barbarossa in 1941 were not ignorant of 1812. They had a different argument, that the Soviet military of 1941 was not the Russian military of 1812, that the situation had changed in ways that made the comparison invalid. The Red Army had suffered massive purges of its officer corps in the late 1930s. Soviet leadership had been decimated. The first weeks of Barbarossa seemed to confirm this. Early German advances were dramatic and deep. Soviet forces fell into encirclements. Millions of soldiers were captured in the opening months of the campaign. The argument had a real factual basis. The early results seemed to validate it, but the deeper structure of the problem was the same, and the argument missed it. German forces crossed the Soviet border on June 22, 1941. Operation Barbarossa was the largest military invasion in human history. An estimated 3 million German and Axis troops, 3,600 tanks, 7,400 artillery pieces, and 2,700 aircraft committed to 3 simultaneous army groups pushing toward Leningrad in the north, Moscow in the center, and Ukraine and the oil fields of the Caucasus in the south. The plan assumed a campaign of between 8 and 16 weeks. It was designed around the same logic that had made German warfare so lethal in Western Europe. Strike fast, encircle large formations, destroy coherent enemy resistance before it can reconstitute, accept surrender of political structure, occupy and hold. What it encountered was different. The Soviet Union activated, under the framework of its wartime state-directed economy, a scorched earth policy formalized through an internal directive on June 29, 1941, and made public by Stalin in a national broadcast on July 3, 1941, days after Barbarossa began. Documented provisions included the destruction of food stocks, industrial facilities, bridges, roads, fuel depots, and infrastructure that could be used by the advancing German forces. The Dnieper hydroelectric dam, at the time one of the largest dams in the world, was demolished by Soviet engineers in August 1941 to slow the German advance. Industrial equipment across the Western Soviet Union, entire factories, documented in Soviet records as comprising over 1,500 major industrial enterprises, was disassembled and relocated by rail to the Ural Mountains and Siberia beyond the operational reach of the Wehrmacht. The German army advanced. The speed of advance in the first months was real. Encirclements at Kyiv, Smolensk and Vyazma resulted in the capture of millions of Soviet soldiers and the destruction of entire army groups. By German reckoning in late autumn 1941, they had captured or destroyed enough Soviet military equipment and personnel to have defeated most European armies several times over. The Soviet state did not stop. Here is the specific mechanism that mirrors 1709 and 1812. German logistics had been calibrated for a short campaign. Fuel reserves, ammunition stockpiles, winter equipment, replacement parts, all were sized for 8 to 16 weeks. As weeks became months, and the front stretched from the Arctic to the Black Sea, German supply lines, operating across territory with infrastructure that had been deliberately degraded, began to break down in the same fundamental pattern as Napoleon's logistics had broken down in 1812. The German army reached the approaches to Moscow in early December 1941. Some forward units could see the city. The Wehrmacht's Army Group Center, which had advanced roughly 1,000 kilometers, about 600 miles, from the border in 5 months, had soldiers wearing summer uniforms in -30 to -40 degrees Celsius temperatures. Equipment designed without winter lubrication requirements seized, vehicles didn't start, weapons jammed. Frostbite casualty rates in some units exceeded combat casualty rates. On December 5, 1941, 2 days before Pearl Harbor, the Soviet Union launched a massive counter-offensive at Moscow. Fresh Soviet divisions transferred from Siberia and the Soviet Far East, properly equipped for winter warfare, struck German forces that were already logistically exhausted and climatically degraded. The German offensive toward Moscow, the objective that German planners had believed would end the Soviet war, was stopped and driven back. It was not the last winter of the Eastern Front. The war continued for nearly 4 more years and became the largest and bloodiest conflict in human history. But the strategic inflection point, the moment when Barbarossa's core assumption that the Soviet Union could be defeated rapidly failed completely, happened in December 1941. In the same pattern as 1709, in the same pattern as 1812, and like both of those campaigns, the decisive damage had been done before winter. The winter was the finishing blow. The strategic depth, the scorched earth, the refusal to deliver a concentrated defensive battle on terms favorable to the attacker, that was what created the conditions winter then exploited. When you look at all 3 campaigns next to each other, the specific elements that repeat are precise enough that military historians treat this as a documented strategic doctrine rather than coincidence. The elements are consistent. First, a refusal to engage on the attacker's preferred terms. None of the 3 invaders got the decisive early engagement they needed. Charles the Fiend looked for a Narva-style knockout. Napoleon looked for an Austerlitz-style encirclement and destruction. German planners expected blitzkrieg encirclements to produce rapid collapse. In all 3 cases, the expected decisive battle was denied. Second, systematic resource denial. Not just retreating and destroying. Burning the thing behind you, so the enemy cannot use it. This is the documented scorched earth policy applied at scale in all 3 campaigns. It functions because large armies need to extract resources from the territory they advance through. They cannot carry everything with them across thousands of kilometers. Remove the territory's ability to provide those resources, and the army begins to consume itself. Third, strategic depth as a weapon. Russia's geographic scale is not incidental to this strategy. It is the strategy. An invader who needs a short campaign to win cannot win if the distance required to reach a decisive engagement is greater than the army's operational range in the conditions being imposed on it. Sweden's army ran out of operational capacity before Poltava. Napoleon's army ran out before Moscow. Germany's army ran out before Moscow in the same geography, 2 centuries later. Fourth, the time factor. The attacker's confidence is highest at the beginning. Their supplies are fullest. Their equipment is newest. Their soldiers are in the best physical condition they will be throughout the campaign. Every kilometer of advance and every week of operational time degrades all of those factors. The defender operating on home territory with shorter supply lines and the ability to receive reinforcements is in a more sustainable position as time extends. All 3 of these elements were present in 1709, 1812 and 1941. In all 3 cases, military commanders who were among the most capable in European history could not solve the problem these 4 elements created in combination. There is one thing worth being direct about here, because it's important for understanding what this pattern actually is and what it isn't. Saying Russia's strategic doctrine worked does not mean it came without enormous cost to Russia itself. In 1812, the destruction of Moscow and the burning of villages was paid for by Russian civilians who lost everything. In 1941, The scorched earth policy destroyed Soviet industrial infrastructure that had taken decades to build. The civilian population of the Soviet Union paid a price in 1941 to 1945 that is almost impossible to convey in numbers. Soviet military and civilian deaths during the Second World War are estimated at between 26 and 27 million people. The strategy worked strategically. The human cost of that strategy on the defending population was catastrophic. Both of those things are true simultaneously. If you've made it this far and you're getting something out of this, the subscribe button is right there. This channel exists for people who want history explained at this level, not simplified below it. Military analysts and historians who study the Russian strategic doctrine of strategic depth and resource denial consistently note one specific challenge with the modern version of this pattern. It depends on the physical inaccessibility of the territory's interior. In 1709, there was no way to strike a target 3,000 kilometers inside Russian territory from the front line. In 1812, the same limitation applied. In 1941, long-range bombing existed, but could not destroy the relocated Soviet industrial base fast enough or comprehensively enough to prevent it from producing the weapons that the counteroffensive used. The core of the strategy, trade space for time, deny resources, let the attacker exhaust itself, then counter, functioned because the interior was genuinely unreachable by the technologies of those eras. Modern long-range precision strike capability, drone warfare, and satellite-guided logistics have changed the physics of this problem. Military analysts writing in the current period note that the traditional concept of strategic depth is under significant pressure from technologies that can reach targets hundreds or thousands of kilometers from the front line without requiring a ground force to get there. Whether the pattern can repeat in a world with these capabilities is a genuinely open military question. What is not open is that it repeated 3 times across 2 centuries against 3 different adversaries, and each time the adversaries entered knowing what had happened to the others. That is the part of this history that stays with you. Charles V knew Russia was a difficult theater. Napoleon's generals had read the history. German officers had studied 1812 in detail. They all thought they had a reason it would be different this time. None of them were right. If you want to understand why some of history's most capable military forces failed in ways that should not have been possible, the Eastern Front and what preceded it is where that study begins. We have a breakdown of Operation Barbarossa's planning failures, specifically what the German High Command got wrong in the 8 weeks before the invasion launched, that goes deeper into the logistics and intelligence failures that the overview here doesn't have space to cover. That's where we're going next.